So I know we did some of this in class, but I think it's still probably a little hazy. So I wanted to give you one more example. This one's going to be with strings. So say you went fishing and you caught a fish this big. It's outside the, yeah. Okay, so you're going to write a method that tells about the size of the fish you caught. And here, if you put in 5 as your input, right, is the argument, the fish was this big. You see how it has, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 eyes in it, right? And if you put in a 10, you get 10 eyes. The fish was this big. All right, so we're writing that method. So the first thing I need to do is finish the header. So I've got public static string tell fish story. So it's gonna, the output is going to be a string, but I need to know what the parameter is. So I look at what's here, and it looks like it's gonna be an integer. So I'll make it int and something useful, like the number of eyes? Number of eyes. Well, it looks funny, but whatever. Okay. So the very first thing I want to do, if I'm writing a method that returns, is create a variable to return. So in this case, it's going to be creating the story. So I'm going to make my variable a string, and I'm going to call it story. Now I need to initialize it to something. If you're not sure, you can usually just initialize it to an empty string, and that's fine. In this case, it looks like what I'm going to do is separate this into 2 pieces. So the fish was this big, this much is going to be, we're going to add on to that with a bunch of eyes, right? And we're going to use the loop to build up the number of eyes that we need. And then we're going to add another piece, which is this last part, to the, including the exclamation point, to the end of the story, right? So I actually don't want an empty string to start. I probably want this part, right? So I wanted to start with the fish was and then I don't have any eyes yet, okay? So I'm going to start with that. So if nothing else happened, down here at the very bottom, I'm going to return my story. On the AP test, this is at least half a point. I've done basically nothing, but it's half a point out of 9. So that's a good start. Okay, now I know I'm going to use a while loop. That's kind of my goal right now, is to help you use while loops. And I want to check, I want to run it a whole bunch of times until I've gotten the correct number of eyes. So I'm going to run it as long as something is less than the number of eyes. Okay, in my word. So I need to set up a variable that's going to count up, right? So I need some kind of a counter. Now, I could make it just called counter, or I could make it like, count. Ooh, even better. Let's make it Apple themed. iCount. Okay, it's now called iCount. Now, when I start, there are no eyes, so it seems reasonable to initialize that to 0. But in other problems, you might want to initialize this to something else. But if it's a counter, usually 0 is a good start. Okay, so as long as iCount is less than the number of eyes that I'm supposed to have, this code is going to run. So what I want to do in this code is I want to build up eyes. So I want to take story and I want to add on to it. So I'm going to add on to it an I every single time it runs through this loop, right? So I'm going to take what was here, story, add on to it. So now it says the fish was this, right? And then I'm going to store that back in story. So now the story variable has been updated. Okay, now if I close this loop right here, I can check iCount was 0, I added on an I, but I never changed I count, it's still 0. And this thing is gonna run forever. You really need to make sure that you also change the value of that counter. So I count is equal to I count plus 1. Okay. Here's where we initialize that. This is initializing the return variable. All right. So now I've added on all my i's. I need to finish off my story, because if I send it back right now, I've only got the fish was then, that's all I got. So I need the last part. So story gets story plus s big. Okay. Now that should return the right thing. I can make this code a little bit shorter though. So I'm gonna go through and change a few things. If you submit this code, I'm perfectly happy. But there are some things that we can change, and so I'm gonna show you those things now. All right, first off, we talked about this in class. So one way to change I count is to write it like this, but something that means exactly the same thing, I count plus 1, is I count plus equals 1. So if I have I count plus equals 1, that will bump I count up by 1. Another way to write this, instead of plus equals 1, is also to write I count plus plus. If you write I count plus plus, it'll bump it up by 1. Plus equals can be used with numbers that aren't 1, like plus equals 2, plus equals 10. It'll increment by 2 or increment by 10. Plus plus really only does the up by 1, but it's a super fast way to write it, and so you'll see it a lot in Java. Okay, down here I have the story gets the story plus, okay, so I could just as easily have story plus equals that, and I could put it up here too. Story plus equals I. The exact same thing as having story plus I. Now, I can do something else. Return doesn't have to just return a variable, it could do some calculations on its line. So instead of returning story after I've fixed it, I can return right here. Return story plus this string, s big. And that's exactly the same as what I had before, just a little shorter. There are times when you really want to put everything into one variable and then return it, and it's really helpful to have that kind of a return, the kind I had the first time, when you're debugging large programs, because you can see in the debugger the value of a particular variable. I can't see the value of this if it were stored all in one variable, story, before I returned. When I went through line by line in the debugger, I could see in the variables window what the value of story was before it was returned. So it might help a little bit with debugging not to do this, but in really short pieces, it's not a big deal to be able to do that. And so I don't think I talked about it yet, and I wanted to let you know. All right? Fish story!